Last year, I took a road trip to visit a couple of friends I studied with in high school. They had moved to Berkeley to study at the University of California, and since then, every summer, I travel to visit them. We've been friends for so long that we're practically like brothers. This is a trip I usually take by plane, but last year I drove because there were several places along the way that I really wanted to visit, including parks, museums, and historical sites. I left early to have time to visit these sites since the trip would take a few days. The first 2 days went smoothly, but on the third day, I was still driving late into the night, around 9 or 10 p.m. by this time. The road was quiet, and there wasn't much traffic. I've always been a little afraid of desolate roads, but I still had a few hours to go before reaching my destination. I needed a break, so I stopped at a small rest stop on the side of the road. The place was quite dark, and there didn't seem to be anyone around. I parked my car, stretched a bit, and went inside. The building was small, with restrooms and a couple of vending machines. After a few minutes, I noticed a car had parked right next to mine, even though the parking lot was empty. This seemed odd, but I ignored it and went to the restroom. When I came out, the car was still there with its lights on, and the driver hadn't left. It made me uneasy, but I continued on, buying a Red Bull from the vending machine. While drinking it, I couldn't help but glance at the car again. The driver was still inside, and soon after, the car's engine turned off. A tall, bearded man in a brown leather jacket got out and started walking toward me. He had both hands in his pockets, and something about him didn't sit right with me. I nodded in greeting as we passed each other, but then I heard him call out, "Hey." I turned around to see him pointing a 9mm pistol at my face, a macabre smile on his lips. He demanded my watch, wallet, and phone. I gave him everything without hesitation, hoping it would end there. But instead, he motioned for me to follow him into the forest behind the rest stop. My heart raced, and I feared for my life. As we walked deeper into the woods, I begged him to let me go, even offering him my car. He remained silent. After leading me about 20 meters into the forest, he asked me to stop and kneel down. I closed my eyes, knowing this was the end. He fired 3 shots, and I fell to the ground, screaming and covering my ears. But I felt no pain. Opening my eyes, I realized he hadn't shot me. Instead, he laughed, told me to go home, and said, "Don't forget to wash your pants." Then he casually walked away, still laughing. Shaking and terrified, I made my way back to the rest stop, washed my face, and drove to the nearest town to call the police. I gave them a description of the man, but I never found out what happened to him. I stayed at my friend's house for a couple of weeks, but the fear and humiliation stayed with me for months. Even today, the memory of that night still haunts me, and I haven't stopped at a rest stop since. Hello, my name is Dan, and I've been driving a truck for over 25 years. The story I'm going to tell you today happened about 4 years ago, and it's something that marked my life forever. It was a rainy night, and I was driving my huge truck on the highway, which by that time was completely deserted since it was 4 in the morning. I was about 4 hours away from arriving at the company's warehouse, where I had to deliver a shipment of industrial supplies, when a torrential rain, seemingly out of nowhere, began to fall. This made visibility difficult on the road, but after so many years in this profession, I've grown used to driving in these conditions for long hours. Although it didn't prevent me from being annoyed at the thought that the rain would delay me, the downpour wasn't the only thing that caused me discomfort that night. For some unknown reason, since I entered the last stretch of road, a strange restlessness began to take over my body. I couldn't describe exactly what it was. I just know that something felt strange. Maybe it was the eerie silence surrounding me or the fact that I had been driving for many hours without rest. What's certain is that I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to push it aside by turning on some music, and although it helped to distract my mind a bit, the strange feeling never fully went away. I kept driving despite the poor visibility, but I slowed down to maintain control in case anything unexpected happened, a precaution I always take when driving in the rain. A few kilometers ahead, something very unexpected occurred. The rain was still pouring, and the fog was growing thicker, but through the fog, I saw the lights of a car speeding toward me in the opposite direction. It was heading directly for my truck. Due to the thick fog, I couldn't see it until it was practically right in front of me. Reflexively, I turned the steering wheel at the last second to avoid a collision, but the wet road made it impossible to regain control of my truck. No matter how hard I tried to stabilize it, I ended up flipping violently and spinning off the road. The last thing I remember was the sensation of weightlessness as the truck spun and the thunderous noise of the crash. When I woke up, I was lying on the cold ground, everything a blur. My head throbbed with pain, and my body felt heavy. I tried to move but quickly realized I was severely injured and couldn't move my legs. In a state of shock, I tried to piece together what had just happened. Eventually, it all came back to me: the car ramming into me, my attempt to steer the truck, the overturning, the noise, the pain, and now here I was, lying in the middle of nowhere, injured and alone. I tried to call for help, but my voice was too weak to make a sound. I was trapped in the wreckage, unsure how long I'd survive. As I lay there struggling to keep my eyes open, I began to hear footsteps approaching and the sound of an engine running in the distance. A few moments later, an older man, along with a younger one, appeared. They were a father and son, and they helped me by calling for an ambulance. At times I could feel myself losing consciousness, but I fought to stay awake, knowing help was on the way. Finally, the ambulance arrived, and I was rushed to the hospital. On the way, I drifted in and out of consciousness, but I remember the doctors telling me that I had several broken bones, internal bleeding, and a severe head injury. They also said I was lucky to be alive. I couldn't believe it. I had been in a near-fatal accident and had no idea how I was going to recover, or if I really would. Judging by what the doctors said, I thought these might be my last moments on Earth. Fortunately, I didn't die, but the recovery process was torturous. There were days when I wished I had died. Weeks passed, and I was still in the hospital, unable to move and completely dependent on the nurses and doctors. I had never felt so helpless in my life. But as the days went by, I began to notice strange things happening around me. There were times when I'd wake up in the middle of the night and feel like someone was watching me. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, maybe a result of my brain injury. But the more it happened, the more convinced I became that something was not right. One night as I lay in bed, I saw a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was a tall, dark figure, but I couldn't make out its features. I tried to scream, but no sound came out of my mouth. Meanwhile, the figure approached me and I tried to move, but I was paralyzed, completely desperate and terrified. The figure came closer and closer until I could feel its cold breath right on my face. I closed my eyes tightly and began to pray, my heart pounding in my ears. After what felt like an eternity, I finally opened my eyes, and the figure was gone. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I told the nurses what had happened, but they dismissed it as an episode of sleep paralysis, possibly caused by my brain injury and the stress I was under. But I knew it wasn't just a hallucination. What I had seen felt very real. From that day on, I began to see the figure more frequently. It appeared at any time of day, and the more I saw it, the more terrified I became. But I didn't tell anyone else. Instead, I started researching online, as I was convinced this figure had something to do with the accident. During my search, I discovered that on the stretch of road where my accident occurred, there had been many other similar accidents. Many victims had reported strange occurrences, like seeing lights of a car coming toward them or a figure standing in the road, causing them to crash. At that moment, I knew I wasn't alone in my experience, and that this figure or ghost had caused my accident. I was terrified, but also angry. I wanted to know why it had happened to me. I wanted to know who or what this figure was and why it was haunting me. But first, I had to confirm that it was real. The man who helped me that night, along with his son, was named William. He had given me his phone number in case I ever needed anything. I decided to call him and ask if he had seen the car that had crashed into me. His answer confirmed what I had suspected: there was no other car. William had been driving a few meters behind my truck when, out of nowhere, my truck turned sharply and started zigzagging until it eventually went off the road. There was no car coming in the opposite direction. Hearing this made my blood run cold. The figure that had caused my accident was real, and it almost cost me my life. That night, the figure appeared again at the foot of my bed. This time it didn't disappear. Instead, it whispered to me, telling me its story. The figure claimed to be the spirit of a truck driver who had died in an accident on that same stretch of road many years ago. He had been driving his truck when a car came toward him, and they collided head-on. No one survived the crash. Before I could ask who he was, a nurse entered the room, and the figure vanished. That was the last time I saw him. The next day, I researched accidents in that area and found a news report from 35 years ago. It detailed a fatal accident where a driver, under the influence of alcohol, had driven the wrong way and collided with a cargo truck. Both drivers had died instantly. There were no details about the drivers, but I realized then that it wasn't the truck driver's spirit that had caused my accident. It was the spirit of the driver of the other car. I now believe that both spirits are trapped, unable to move on from that tragic moment. Since then, I say a prayer for them whenever I pass that stretch of road, hoping they will eventually find peace. My name is Elo, and this all happened in August 2008. I remember it as clear as if it were yesterday. It was one of the hottest summers we'd had in years, and I was behind the wheel of my old cargo truck, hauling a load of steel sheets that were to be used in a construction site in southern Missouri. By then, I had over 20 years of truck driving experience, and I honestly thought I had seen it all. But what happened that day still haunts me to this day. I was driving down Highway 60 through a stretch of road that passed through the Mark Twain National Forest. It's a really beautiful place during the day, but at night it becomes very desolate and scary. I was making good time and planned to stop at a truck stop near Springfield to go to the restroom, get something to eat, and maybe get some sleep before continuing on my route. However, a few miles before arriving at the truck stop, I came across an old beat-up truck parked on the side of the road with its hood up. As I approached, I saw a chubby guy waving his arms at me, signaling for help. We truck drivers have an unspoken code, and that is to always help each other, so I slowed down, parked ahead of him, and walked over to see what was going on. The man was about 45 years old, wearing a baseball cap and a flannel shirt that was supposed to be white but was completely stained with grease, just like his face and hands. It was evident he had been working on his truck for quite some time. By now, the sun was going down, and before I could get to him, he started walking toward me. "Thank God you stopped," he said, clearly relieved. He shook my hand and introduced himself as Neil. He explained that he had been stranded there for about 4 or 5 hours, and apparently his truck had a damaged alternator. He asked if I could give him a ride to the nearest town to spend the night and see if he could find the part and a mechanic in the morning. I looked him over for a few moments. He seemed harmless, so I didn't have the heart to leave him stranded there. After all, the next town was about 20 miles down the road. Neil grabbed a small duffel bag from his truck and climbed into the passenger seat of mine. We were on our way. Neil was a chatty guy. He told me he was from Alabama and was on his way to pick up a load in St. Louis. He also mentioned that his old truck had been giving him trouble for weeks, but he thought he could make it further. About 15 to 20 minutes into the drive, I noticed 2 cars in my rearview mirror, following us very closely. At first, I didn't pay much attention to them, thinking they were just impatient drivers waiting to pass me. But neither car tried to overtake us, and they stayed behind, which started to feel suspicious. I glanced over at Neil and asked if he knew the people in those cars. He turned around, looked, and shook his head. "Never seen them before," he said. I joked, "Are you running from someone?" He laughed nervously but didn't say anything. I could hear the unease in his voice, and frankly, I couldn't blame him because I was starting to feel nervous too. The cars stayed behind us for about 10 miles, never once attempting to pass. It was getting stranger by the minute. Suddenly, when we reached a stretch of road with woods on both sides, the cars made their move. They accelerated and passed us, only to cut in front and force me to brake hard. "What the hell?" I muttered out loud. The cars stopped dead in front of us, and 3 armed men got out, walking toward my truck. My heart pounded as I looked at Neil. He was pale and sweating profusely. I whispered to him to stay calm. I instinctively reached under my seat for my gun, but realized I had left it at home. The company I worked for had recently cracked down on drivers carrying guns, so I hadn't brought it with me on this trip. The men reached my truck and positioned themselves at both doors, pointing their guns at us. One of them ordered us to get out. I raised my hands, trying to stay calm, and told Neil to do the same. We slowly stepped out of the truck, and as we did, Neil stumbled. The man who seemed to be in charge told us to move to the side of the road. He ordered us to empty our pockets, and we handed over our wallets, phones, and keys. I even offered them the truck, saying, "Take it if you want. Just let us go." But the man snapped, "Shut up," as he threw our things into one of the cars. He then threw my truck keys back at me, ordering me to start the engine. Confused, I did as I was told. Neil, however, was instructed to get into one of the cars. We both exchanged a look of disbelief but knew we couldn't argue with men holding guns. I started the truck, and they made me follow the car Neil was in. Another car followed behind us. We drove for what felt like hours, but in reality it was probably just 20 minutes. The men led us down a narrow dirt road deeper into the woods. My mind raced, trying to figure out how to escape, but there was no way out. Even if I could escape, I couldn't leave Neil behind. The trees closed in around us, and I knew we were being led into a trap. The cars stopped in a small clearing in the woods, and the men ordered me out of the truck again. I stepped out, my heart racing. If they wanted to just rob us, they would have left by now. Something far worse was about to happen. The ringleader motioned for me to follow him into the woods, where Neil was already being led by another man. This guy had a devilish look on his face and smiled at me in a way that made my stomach twist. After a few minutes, we arrived at an old abandoned cabin. The sight of it filled me with dread. The men pushed us inside and tied our hands and feet. "Neil, shaking uncontrollably, whispered, "They're going to kill us, aren't they?" I tried to reassure him, saying, "Not if we can escape first." I worked frantically to loosen the ropes around my wrists, and after what felt like an eternity, I finally freed myself. I untied Neil, and we quietly slipped out of the cabin. It was already dark, and visibility was low, but we could tell that the men in their cars were gone. Neil asked if I knew how to get back to the road, and I had a vague idea, but I knew we had to walk in the opposite direction of the cabin. We stuck close to the edge of the road, ready to dive into the woods if we heard anyone coming. After what seemed like an eternity, we heard a vehicle approaching. We hid in the trees until we saw that it was an old sedan driven by an older man. Relieved, we stepped out and waved him down. "Please, we need your help," I said, explaining that we had been kidnapped and robbed. The man, whose name was Jeff, agreed to take us to the nearest sheriff's office in a small town called Ellington. At the sheriff's office, we gave our statements, describing the men and everything that had happened. Sheriff Stewart, a grizzled veteran, took our story seriously. "We'll send a patrol to look for your truck and those men," he assured us. "You two are lucky to be alive." We were indeed lucky, but still shaken to the core. A few hours later, the deputies found my truck, abandoned in the trees but otherwise intact. Although the men were never caught, I will never forget that night. It changed me forever. Since then, I've become much more cautious, always on guard, and always ready for the unexpected. Though I still help people when I can, I am far more careful now. And every time I drive down a lonely, dark stretch of highway, I can't help but think of those men and wonder if they're still out there, looking for their next victim. My name is Ernesto, and the story I'm about to share happened to me one night, in what turned out to be the scariest situation I've ever experienced in my life. I used to work nights in Arizona, almost in the middle of nowhere, on an old ranch that had been converted into a hotel. It was a great place to work, probably the easiest job I've ever had, but the only downside was having to drive an hour and a half back home every night. The commute was exhausting, and at first I hated it, but over time I got used to it. One night, during my usual drive home, I stopped at a taco truck that was about halfway there to grab a bite to eat. I was completely starving and couldn't wait to get home. The truck was located just outside an RV park, so I assumed the owner either lived there or parked there every night to sell his tacos. I had seen this truck several times before, but I had never stopped by. That night I was too hungry to keep driving, so I pulled off the road and walked towards the truck. To my surprise, the tacos were some of the best I'd ever eaten. I ordered them to go and ate them in my car. Maybe it was my hunger talking, but they tasted like pure glory. I drove home that night feeling like I had made an excellent culinary discovery. The next night I did the same thing, and soon it became a regular stop on my drive home from work. I wouldn't eat the tacos in my car in desperation anymore. Either I'd stand by the truck, savoring the variety of salsas, finishing with a soda and a cigarette. Despite stopping there frequently and chatting with the taco guy, often, I never asked him his name, and he never asked for mine. It seemed unimportant at the time. I was just one of many regular customers, and the tacos were good enough for me not to worry about it. But I should have asked his name. One day, that information would have been crucial. It was the day when everything seemed normal at first, but quickly turned bizarre. I parked my car in the usual spot and walked toward the truck, expecting to order my regular tacos, but the taco guy wasn't there. His truck was parked as usual, but no one was inside and there were no customers either. The place was eerily silent. I figured he was busy in the back or organizing supplies, so I waited for a few minutes. As I waited, I began to smell something burning. I looked toward the truck's grill and noticed smoke rising from it. Something was definitely burning. I called out to the taco guy, thinking he'd left something on the grill by mistake. But there was no response. I started getting worried. The longer I waited, the more I could smell the burning, and smoke was now coming out from behind the truck. I had a strange feeling in my gut that something wasn't right. I thought about just leaving, but I didn't want to see my favorite taco truck go up in flames, so I decided to investigate. I walked around to the side of the truck where the narrow door and retractable stairs were located. I climbed the stairs and grabbed the door handle, opening it cautiously. As soon as I stepped inside, I saw the open cash register, its drawer overturned, and coins scattered across the floor. My first thought was that someone had robbed the taco guy. Despite the chaos, I didn't see any signs of a struggle. Maybe someone had threatened him with a weapon and told him to run. But as I approached the grill to turn it off, I saw something that made my heart nearly stop. There on the grill was the charred, blackened outline of a hand. It was as if someone had placed their hand directly onto the hot surface and left it there to burn. The shock was so intense that I almost fell backward, but I managed to keep my balance. I quickly turned off the grill, then stepped back out of the truck, my mind racing. I had no idea what had happened, but I knew I had to call the police. I walked to my car, pulled out my phone, and dialed 911. When the operator asked what the emergency was, I stammered through an explanation, telling them about the burning handprint and the open cash register. The operator assured me that officers were on their way, but as I waited, no one showed up. I stood there for nearly an hour waiting, but the police never arrived. The whole situation felt surreal, and my thoughts kept spinning. Where was the taco guy? Was he hurt? Had someone taken him? Why didn't the police come? After nearly an hour with no sign of the authorities or the taco guy, I decided to leave. I drove home, feeling numb and confused. For the next few days, I kept an eye out for any news about what had happened. I tried searching online for anything related to a robbery or a burned hand at a taco truck, but I found nothing. The taco truck never returned to that spot, and I never saw the taco guy again. To this day, I still don't know what happened that night. I regret not asking for his name, because maybe it would have helped in some way. I just hope that wherever he is, he's okay. This all happened 6 years ago, sometime in June 2018. Back then, I decided to go on an impromptu solo trip for the day. I really enjoy sightseeing, and there were a couple of places somewhat nearby that I still wanted to cross off my list before I had to go back to college in August. The plan was simple: get up early, start the road trip, visit a few different sites during the day, and drive home around 9 p.m. or so. I figured this way I could maximize my time without having to pay for a hotel, saving some money in the process. The trip started fine, but the return was a different story. I ended up leaving around 10 p.m., and according to Apple Maps, it would take about 4.5 hours to get home. I made it halfway through the drive when I started to feel tired. I tried washing my face with water from my canteen several times, but it didn't help. Eventually, it got dangerous to keep driving, and I told myself I'd pull over at the next rest stop and take a nap for an hour. A few miles down the road, I spotted a rest stop and pulled into the empty parking lot. The place was completely deserted, and if not for the few lights on, it might have seemed abandoned. I figured that made sense. It was late, and the road wasn't particularly busy. I leaned back in my seat, set an alarm to wake me in an hour, and fell asleep. When the alarm went off, I woke up feeling groggy but relieved to have gotten some rest. Now I needed to use the bathroom. I got out of my car and started walking toward the building. As I entered the restroom and opened one of the cubicles, I heard someone talking outside in the hallway. This startled me because my car was the only one in the lot. I didn't see how someone could have gotten there so quickly. A moment later, the restroom door opened. By this time, I was a little nervous, but I figured it was just another traveler who must have pulled in while I wasn't looking. I had only been in the cubicle for about 30 seconds when I heard a light knocking on the cubicle door. I awkwardly responded, "There's someone in here," but there was no response. The silence was unsettling. Suddenly, I saw an eye peering through the crack in the cubicle door. The moment we made eye contact, the person outside started screaming and banging his head against the door. Shocked and terrified, I pressed my body against the door to keep him from breaking through. His relentless banging and screaming only got louder. Thinking fast, I threw the door open, knocking the guy down, and bolted out of the bathroom as fast as I could. I was halfway across the parking lot when I heard the front door of the building open behind me. I turned to look and saw the man running after me. Thankfully, I was faster, and I managed to reach my car first. I started the engine and began backing out of the lot, but just as I accelerated, the man slammed his body into the side of my car. I kept going, speeding away from the rest stop. As I drove off, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw the man standing in the parking lot, staring after me. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching as I drove away. I was beyond shocked. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't process what had just happened. You always hear crazy stories like this, but you never think it'll happen to you. For the rest of the drive home, I was filled with adrenaline. Needless to say, I didn't feel tired anymore. I drove the entire way home, probably well over the speed limit. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, unable to shake the image of that man standing in the lot, screaming and banging on the door. I had no idea who he was, where he came from, or what he wanted. If I had to guess, I'd say he was probably a homeless man who wasn't in the right state of mind. But then again, why would a homeless person be out in the middle of nowhere, at a rest stop on the side of a highway? It didn't make any sense. How did he get there? All I know is that since that night, I have never stopped at a rest stop again, and I plan to avoid them for the rest of my life. I always looked forward to hitting the road with my son, Tom, just the two of us rolling down the highway, making memories. But this time was different. We were driving through West Virginia on our way to visit some family, and everything that could go wrong was going wrong. The AC in the car had died, leaving us to stew in the sticky August heat. Tom, who's 9, was getting fidgety, and I wasn't in the mood to play car games. The combination of exhaustion, heat, and general frustration was building, and I just needed a break from the endless miles of road. We'd been on the road for hours, only stopping briefly to refuel, and both of us were in desperate need of a bathroom break. When I spotted a sign for a rest stop a few miles ahead, it felt like a blessing. Finally, we could stretch our legs, cool down, and get some air that wasn't boiling hot. The rest stop wasn't exactly inviting. It was one of those places that looked like it hadn't seen maintenance in a decade. The parking lot was half empty, with a few trucks scattered around. The building itself was small, with weather-beaten siding and cracked windows. Not the worst I'd seen, but not exactly the kind of place you'd want to linger. Tom, of course, didn't care. He just wanted out of the car. He hopped out almost as soon as I put the car in park, running toward the restroom area before I could even tell him to stay close. I watched him go, trying to shake off the irritation that had been hanging over me all day. I figured I'd let him burn off some energy while I used the bathroom myself. As I walked toward the building, I had this strange feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't anything obvious, just the sense that everything was too quiet. Even the few people milling around didn't seem like they belonged. But I brushed it off. I just wanted to get back on the road. When we were back in the car, I noticed a white pickup truck a few spaces down. There was a guy inside, a man in his 50s or so, just sitting there looking like he had nothing better to do. His eyes followed us as we backed out of the spot, but I didn't think much of it. People stare. It's what they do. We got back on the highway, and things seemed to settle down. Tom was finally quiet, staring out the window, and I started to feel a little better. With the windows rolled down, the wind wasn't as good as AC, but it was something. I started thinking about what we'd do once we got to our destination, maybe grab some dinner, relax for the evening. The rest stop was already fading from my mind. But about 10 minutes down the road, I saw that same white pickup truck in my rearview mirror. It was definitely following us, a little too closely for comfort. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. The guy must have gotten back on the road the same time we did. But after a few more miles, it was clear he wasn't just going in the same direction, he was following us. I tried to shake him off by speeding up, but the truck kept pace. Slowing down didn't help either. He adjusted his speed to match mine, staying at the same distance behind us no matter what I did. My irritation was creeping back in, along with something else, something worse. "What's that truck doing?" Dad Tom asked from the back seat. "I don't know, bud. Probably just some guy not paying attention," I said, trying to keep my tone light. No point in freaking him out. But deep down, I wasn't buying my own explanation. I needed to figure out what this guy's deal was. After a few more miles, the pickup finally pulled up alongside us, matching our speed. I looked over, and the driver was staring directly at me, his face twisted in urgency. He was waving his hand, trying to get me to roll down my window. I hesitated. The last thing I wanted to do was interact with some random stranger, especially one who'd been tailing us for miles. But his expression wasn't aggressive. He looked scared, or at least concerned. Despite knowing it wasn't the smartest move, I cracked the window just enough to hear him. "There's something in your car," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. "What?" "The back seat. Check your back seat." At first, I didn't understand what he was saying, but then his words hit me like a freight train. The back seat. Tom. I turned around, my heart leaping into my throat. Tom was sitting there, perfectly still, staring out the window. But just beyond him, on the far side of the back seat, I saw the shadow of something lurking just out of view. My body went cold. I hit the brakes, swerving onto the shoulder as quickly as I could. The pickup truck followed, pulling off the road behind me. I threw the car into park, my hands shaking as I unbuckled my seatbelt and turned fully around to face the back seat. Before I could say anything, the back door flung open and a figure bolted out of the car. It was a man looking worn down and wearing tattered clothes. He didn't look back as he sprinted across the highway and disappeared into the thick trees on the other side. I just sat there, stunned. It took a few seconds to process what had just happened. Dad Tom's voice was shaky. "Who was that?" I didn't know how to answer. I just reached over and pulled him close, checking to make sure he was all right. He seemed fine, just shaken up like I was. I looked back toward the highway, but the man was long gone. The guy from the pickup truck came running over. "Are you okay? Did you see him?" I nodded, still trying to catch my breath. "Yeah, I saw him." We stayed on the side of the road for a while, long enough to explain the situation to the guy in the pickup and gather ourselves. Tom kept asking who the man was and why he'd gotten into our car, but I didn't have any answers. All I knew was that somewhere between the rest stop and the highway, a complete stranger had climbed into the back seat of our car, hiding under our backpacks and coats, and he stayed there for miles without us knowing. The man from the pickup said he noticed it right after we pulled out from the rest stop. He saw the guy slipping into the car when I wasn't looking. I guess I was too distracted by the heat, the drive, and everything else, and I hadn't thought to check the back seat when Tom got in. We didn't call the police. By the time I thought to, the intruder was long gone, and honestly, I didn't want to relive the whole thing. I just wanted to get back on the road. As we drove away, I kept checking the back seat in the rearview mirror. But of course, it was just Tom looking out the window, lost in his thoughts. Neither of us talked much for the rest of the trip. There wasn't much to say. Every time I think back on that drive, I still wonder who that guy was and what he intended to do. All I know is that we got lucky. Lucky that the guy in the pickup saw him, and lucky that we didn't find out the hard way what he was capable of. Road trips are supposed to be fun. You pack your stuff, grab your friends, pick a destination, and hit the road. That's exactly what we did. A couple of friends and I, all crammed into Jason's old EV, headed to a weekend music festival 3 states away. There was something about being on the open road, with the windows down and music blasting, that made the miles fly by. It was me, Jason, Sarah, and Maria. We'd been friends for years, and this trip felt like the perfect way to unwind. No stress, just good vibes. We left a little later than we meant to, and by the time we crossed into unfamiliar territory, the sun was already sinking low. Winding roads, hills, and trees as far as we could see. There were fewer and fewer cars, and soon enough, we were practically the only ones on the highway. We should have taken the main route, Maria muttered from the back seat, her phone showing nothing but a blank screen where the GPS used to be. It's like we're driving through a dead zone out here. This way is quicker. Trust me, Jason shrugged. The GPS will kick back in eventually. I wasn't so sure about that, but I kept quiet. I was riding shotgun, trying to help navigate. The sky was getting darker, and the roads were getting narrower. Eventually we passed by an old rusty sign that read Bridge 10 mi ahead. We'll cross the bridge and find somewhere to stop for the night, Jason said. Shouldn't be too far now. A few minutes later, we saw something ahead, something standing just off to the side of the road. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer, but as we got closer, it became clear that it was a person. He was just standing there, next to an old mile marker, staring off into the distance. He didn't look like a hitchhiker, no thumb out, no backpack, just a man standing perfectly still. His clothes were dark, almost blending into the night, but there was something off about him. I couldn't put my finger on it. Jason slowed down as we approached, but none of us said anything at first. You think he needs help? Sarah asked. We're not stopping, Maria said quickly from the back. I don't care if he's broken down or whatever, no way. Jason kept driving, his eyes flicking to the man as we passed. There was something strange about the way the guy was standing, like he wasn't really aware of the car or us at all. He didn't turn to look at us as we passed. He just stood there, staring into the woods. It wasn't until we were a mile or two further down the road that anyone spoke again. That was weird, Jason muttered. Did you see his face? No, I said. He didn't look at us. I swear his eyes were open, but he wasn't blinking, just staring like a statue or something, Maria chimed in. Maybe he's waiting for someone, Sarah offered, though she didn't sound convinced. "Let's just get across this bridge," I said, trying to push the weirdness of it out of my head. I'm not loving this detour. The further we drove, the more isolated the road felt. There were no street lights, no signs of life, just trees and road. Every now and then, I thought I saw shadows moving in the woods, but I chalked it up to the flickering headlights in my tired eyes. After what felt like forever, we finally reached the bridge. It was old, rusted steel beams, narrow and barely wide enough for 2 cars. Below, a slow-moving river snaked through the valley. The kind of place that would be beautiful during the day, but was downright eerie at night. Jason slowed the car down as we crossed, the tires making an unsettling clunking noise on the metal. Halfway across, Maria gasped. "Oh my God, no way." I followed her gaze, and my stomach tightened. There, standing on the other side of the bridge, was the same man we had passed earlier. It didn't make any sense. He couldn't have gotten here before us. We hadn't seen any cars, any turnoffs, nothing. He was just there, standing as still as before, his eyes locked on the car now, watching as we approached. "What the hell?" Jason muttered. "Turn around," Sarah whispered. "We should turn around." But there was no way to turn around on that bridge without backing up, and the last thing any of us wanted was to be stuck there. We had no choice but to drive past him again. Jason pressed the gas, speeding up just a little as we passed the man. This time his head turned slowly to follow us, his eyes never blinking, never leaving the car as we drove by. I caught a glimpse of his face, a blank, emotionless stare. His skin was pale, stretched tight over his features, like he hadn't eaten in weeks. "He's not right," Maria muttered. "There's something wrong with him." No one disagreed. We were all on edge now. Jason kept looking at the rearview mirror, but the man didn't follow us. Still, the tension in the car was thick, and no one dared to break the silence. About 10 minutes later, we saw lights in the distance, what looked like a small gas station or rest stop. Relief washed over me. Finally, we could stop, regroup, figure out where we were, and maybe get a signal again. Jason pulled into the parking lot, and we all piled out of the car, stretching our legs and trying to shake off the weirdness from earlier. The gas station was old, with flickering neon lights and a single attendant inside who barely looked up when we walked in. Maria and Sarah went inside to use the bathroom, while Jason and I stood outside looking at the map on his phone. "I think we'll see that guy again," Jason asked, half joking. "I hope not. This road's got some serious bad vibes." As we stood there, I looked around the parking lot. There were a couple of other cars parked by the pumps, but something felt off again. The night was quiet, the air still. Then I saw movement near the tree line, just beyond the edge of the lot. It was the man, standing just at the edge of the light, barely visible through the shadows. "Jason," I said, "he's here." Jason followed my gaze, and his face paled. The man was just standing there watching us, his figure barely visible in the darkness. "We're leaving," Jason said, not wasting a second. He turned and headed for the car, motioning for the others to hurry up. We jumped back into the SUV, and Jason revved the engine, peeling out of the parking lot without looking back. As we sped away, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, expecting to see the man standing there, watching us leave, but he wasn't there. "Where did he go?" I muttered. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, looking at me. "The guy he was standing by the trees, he's gone." Jason didn't say anything, just pressed harder on the gas, and we sped down the empty road. The atmosphere in the car was thick with tension, and no one spoke for a long while, We drove for what felt like hours, trying to put as much distance as possible between us and that man. The road twisted and turned, but no matter how far we went, we never saw another town, another gas station, or even a sign, just endless darkness, endless road. At some point, Maria asked, "Are we lost?" Jason shook his head. "No, we're on the same road." But it didn't feel like the same road anymore. It felt like we were stuck in some endless loop, driving through the same stretch of highway over and over again, with no way out. Then, up ahead, I saw it again, the bridge. We'd circled back somehow. Jason didn't say a word. He just put the car in reverse and tried to back up slowly. None of us spoke. We were all locked on the figure standing at the entrance of the bridge. It was like we were trapped, unable to move forward. Then something unexpected happened. A flicker of headlights appeared in the distance behind us. A car was coming. "Someone's coming," I whispered. The car behind us was getting closer. For a moment, hope flared in the pit of my stomach. Maybe we weren't stuck on this endless road after all. Maybe this car could help us. Or at the very least, we weren't alone. But as the car approached, something about it seemed wrong. The faint outline of a vehicle rolled slowly toward us. I turned in my seat, staring at the vehicle creeping closer. It wasn't moving fast, just inching toward us like it was waiting. Jason turned and looked too. "Should we stop and let them pass?" he asked. But even as he said it, I knew that wasn't a good idea. Just then, a hand tapped gently on the back window, not a knock, but a soft tap, like someone wanted our attention without causing alarm. Maria gasped. "Oh my God." All of us turned at the same time. Standing right next to the car, his face inches from the window, was the man, the same one we'd seen by the bridge, the one we had tried to leave behind. He wasn't smiling, wasn't doing anything at all, just staring. His face was pale. Jason didn't wait for anyone to say anything. He threw the car into drive, slammed his foot on the gas, and we shot forward, barreling toward the bridge. We raced across it, the car shaking as the tires hit the metal grates. The bridge seemed longer this time, the other side further away than it should have been. But Jason didn't let up. We didn't look back, didn't check to see if the man was still following us. We just focused on the end of that bridge. Finally, the other side came into view, and Jason floored it, speeding down the road until the bridge was out of sight. We drove for what felt like an eternity, the car silent, all of us too scared to even breathe. And then, suddenly, we saw a highway sign, one we hadn't seen before. It was worn and weathered, but it was a sign of civilization. It pointed toward the nearest town, just a few miles away. We didn't speak until we pulled into the brightly lit parking lot of a gas station. Jason parked the car, and we all sat there for a moment, still too shaken to move. "We made it," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Jason nodded, but none of us felt the relief we should have. Even as we stepped out of the car and into the brightly lit gas station, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us, that we'd only narrowly escaped whatever was out there. As we filled the tank and grabbed some snacks inside, I looked back toward the road one last time. It was empty, just a long stretch of asphalt leading back toward the bridge, back toward the dark. But something told me it wasn't over, that we hadn't seen the last of him. That one day, maybe on another road trip, on another forgotten highway, he'd be waiting.